me of the essence of African spirituality. Dr. Carruthers was born and raised in Texas. There he received his undergraduate degree and a master's in government from Texas Southern University. He has a doctorate in political science from the University of Colorado, and he is currently a professor of inner city studies at Northeastern Illinois University. Most important, however, he is a founding director of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. He was our first national president, and he served 3 glorious terms. And he continues to be the rock on which this organization stands. He is also a founding member and director of the Kemetic Institute in Chicago. Brother Jake is a renowned scholar, author, lecturer, and a spiritual leader and teacher. He has an insightful connection with the divine ones, our ancestors. He understands their instructions, and he interprets and he communicates them to us with such clarity that he is clearly the divine speaker of good speech and the divine thinker of deep thought. And he speaks with an ease and an elegance that can only come from his soul, from the God within him. He is author of many articles, essays, and several well-known books. One, The Irritated Genie, which is essays on the Haitian Revolution. He is author of Meta Nature, a book of divine speech. It is a historiographical reflection of African deep thought from the time of Pharaohs to the present. Dr. Clark stated that Professor Carruthers has helped us sharpen our tools for the intellectual battles of the present and the future. And, of course, his latest work of genius, Intellectual Warfare, which Asa Hilliard stated demonstrates the kind of thinking that is required of Africans in order to be free. He is an humble man, one who always asks that not much be said. So we'll simply say, please stand and welcome our beloved brother, Jake from Chicago.
Jehewty, may you come in peace, welcome and greetings. If anybody here was born before February the 15th, 1930, would you give me permission to speak? So I'm the elder. Thank you, sister, for that great, flattering, overinflated introduction. But Jake from Chicago, that's what I use to intimidate people. But thank you so much for inviting me here. It's always a humbling experience to be invited into one of the great families in our movement. I always get so much inspiration by the effort and the commitment that I experience when I come into the Eastern region. And I can see that you have kept that spirit going by this great conference that you have arranged here. So thank you for inviting me, and let me commend you on the work you're doing. And the program so far has been very inspiring and very insightful to me. And it's good to see you again. I would like to bring you greetings from some of the organizations that I represent. The sister doesn't know that I retired from the university in August. But I'm still connected with the center in many, many ways, and so I consider myself a representative of the family of the Center for Inner City Studies, where I worked for more than 3 decades. From the Comedic Institute, of course, which is my heart, where I do my work, and from the Temple of the African Community of Chicago, where we are in the process of restoring an African temple, which fits in with the theme of this conference so very well. The sisters and the brothers in those organizations and institutions send their warm greetings to you, and they are with us in spirit. We are having the regional conference for the Midwest region in Chicago on the first weekend in November, and we invite everybody to attend, because in addition to a very good program, as I have looked over the shoulders of the organizing committee, we are also bringing the members of the planning committee of the African World History Project together to finish our organization for the production of the second volume, which we hope to get out next year. And Sister Nzinga tells me that we're going to have a paperback edition of the first volume in the near future, so be on the lookout for that. And all the friends, I know everybody has the hardback edition, but you can send all of your friends a paperback copy. So please get involved in that. Well, one of my favorite expressions through the years has been this deep well of African culture and African spirituality. And so I'm just delighted to have an opportunity to say something about that. And let me start off with something that John Henry Clark used to say all the time, and everybody has heard it. He said it many, many times, but he published it in his book, Africa at the Crossroads in 1991. And this is the way he put it when he put it in that book. No people can be spiritually, politically, or psychologically free when they worship an image of God assigned to them by another people. The new revolution in Africa that will usher in real independence will start when Africans begin to look at all aspects of their life based upon their spirituality, their culture, and their political interests. That is the instruction from our elder, our master teacher, John Henry Clark. And in a certain sense, he echoed a sentiment that Brother Booker articulated last night that was put this way in 1898, 102 years ago, by Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, that God is a Negro. Both Dr. Clark and Bishop Turner looked at the problem of African spirituality as absolutely critical, that we must approach African spirituality as a part of the liberation movement. If spirituality is not involved in the liberation movement, then it's no good. And if we're going to be liberated, we must liberate our spirituality. And that's what they had in mind. And so we look at all of our great teachers, all of our great leaders, Dr. Ben Yakima, in exposing the origins of the major Western religions, had the same objective, to get us ready spiritually to revolutionize this world. What led these great Africans to radically question the religious traditions they've been raised in? What the search for an African or black God. And then, on the other hand, what led hundreds of Africans during the time I grew up to abandon spirituality altogether, to embrace atheistic Marxism, and ultimately to lead some of our very distinguished thinkers, like Professor John G. Jackson, to embrace atheism. What's going on? And then what has caused so many of us to attempt to return to our traditions in search of spiritual enrichment? But that, of course, leads to the real question, and that is, why did so many of our ancestors abandon our spiritual traditions? And then finally, how can we restore African spirituality to provide a foundation for the present day world, to provide a foundation for our revolution? So I want to try to clarify some of those questions in the next few minutes. I would like to, first of all, do something that I don't ordinarily do, and that is share with you a brief autobiographical sketch of my spiritual sinuity. I call it sinuity. That is my journey to spirituality, or through spirituality. The reason I call it sinuity is because of Sinuate, who left home, went to a foreign country, stayed there for years and years, but finally found his way back home. And that is something that we ought to sort of think about in terms of each of our individual journeys through life. After I do that, I'd like to briefly revisit the history of African spirituality, looking at some of the highlights and some of the lowlights, or the low points. And then I'd like to take a survey, a very brief survey of the deep well of African spirituality, and make a few closing remarks. So if you will bear with me, let me begin. I'm what they call, the common term is PK, a preacher's kid. My daddy was a Methodist minister in the South. In the community that I really first came to consciousness in terms of spirituality, in that context, there was a very small black community, and there were three types of churches there: the Methodist, the Baptist, and the Holiness. The difference, of course, was that the Methodist, as many people have told us, sprinkled, so I was sprinkled. The Baptist inundated in the water, and the Holiness danced. They were the nearest, I think, to African traditional spirituality. And whenever our church service ended, the kids would run over to the Holiness church to catch the dancing, because they danced from 10 o'clock in the morning to 10 o'clock at night. And so I was, came up in the spirit of Protestantism. The difference between Baptists and Methodists wasn't as acute in the South as it was in the North, outside the sprinkling and the inundation. I mean, otherwise, the Methodist church sounded very much like a Baptist church, because the Methodist preacher couldn't stay in those churches in the South unless he preached instead of lectured. So I was surrounded in that kind of black Protestantism. And then on the other side of my family, I had a very, very different type of spiritual experience. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was a Christian Scientist practitioner. She cured people through the Spirit. And she had a great impact on that side of my family. She was truly the matriarch of a part of that. And then in contrast to Mama Stella, my grandmother, was my great aunt, who we called Aunt Susie. Aunt Susie was a client and a devotee of Father Jesse Dale. And Father Jesse Dale was into what we at that time called hoodoo. And Aunt Susie didn't do anything without consulting the prophet Jesse Dale. She consulted him about policy. That is, she played policy, and before she played her policy every day, she would ask him what numbers should she play. And anything that went wrong with any of us, she would put. So I was caught up in several traditions of spirituality as a child, and naturally I was a little confused and a little torn as because Aunt Susie was my favorite. You know, I just liked to hang around her. But then Daddy would tell me, don't listen to that. So, but as I grew up, I had a great concern about this spirituality. And when I went to college, I ran into a very sophisticated college minister, Reverend Howard DeGrasse Asbury, who would pose questions like, do you really believe that Jesus ascended all the way to heaven? Because they tell me that once you get so high, you stop going up and you start going around. And can you see Jesus flipping around in his robes? And then he posed the question, do you believe that God is omnipotent? If you do, can he make a rock so large he can't lift it himself? In other words, he was giving us the shock treatment on these traditional beliefs that we had. And so I began to question this spirituality that I was raised in and tried to figure out what way we ought to go. And finally, I took a brief detour into agnosticism, into atheism, started flirting around with Marxism, and finally just tried to blank the whole spiritual agenda out of my mind as irrelevant and inconsistent with where we were going. But the more I got involved in trying to figure out how we as a people are going to get out of this mess that we're in, the more I began to realize that we ain't going nowhere without spirituality. You can't lead African people without spirituality. I looked at the various movements, and I wondered why Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad had such great followers when these intellectual Marxists had virtually nobody following them. And so finally, I decided that we had better start a serious search for our link to African spirituality. And we had that in mind as we created the Kemetic Institute, the Temple of the African Community of Chicago, and the Foundation of ASCAP. Because as you know, one of the 4 commissions in ASCAP is the Spiritual Commission, the Spiritual Development Commission. So by that time, we were thoroughly convinced that the right road to revolution, the right road to liberation, was a road that was founded in spirituality. What I'd like to do now is to take a brief historical survey of the highlights and the low points of African spirituality, going back about 4,000 years. First of all, bearing in mind what Sheikh Azadiah has told us about the cultural unity of Africa. Beneath and underpinning whatever variety you see in terms of spirituality and in terms of our spiritual journeys over the last 4,000 years, that is a profound cultural and spiritual unity. We have sort of manicured Diop's idea to emphasize the spiritual unity and to emphasize the historical unity. But the one thing that we must point out and must be certain that we emphasize is that there is time and space continuity in our spiritual journeys. If you look at the fact that the tyranny that has descended on African humanity and that has been so prevalent during the last 500 years has not been able to erase traditional African spirituality. That on the continent, you still have what Hampate Ba calls the living tradition that is steeped in the African spirituality. Throughout the diaspora, you have Vodou in Haiti, you have Santeria in Cuba, and Candomblé in Brazil. And all over the diaspora, you have pockets of the celebration of African spirituality. They haven't been able to stamp it out. It's here. And when we look at the focus that we've had for the last 17 or 18 years here in ASCAP, that is Kemet, we can begin to see something about African spirituality and something about the possibilities of African spirituality. One of the things that's outstanding about African spirituality as it was developed in Kemet is the fact that African spirituality in Kemet was based upon an urban-dominated culture. That's something that we have to really look at today because of what is happening to us in this urban-dominated world. We have to understand that that spiritual system that was worked out in Kemet was a cosmopolitan form of African spirituality. It was a form of spirituality that resulted in a synthesis of various perspectives on African spirituality. As the Africans came from all over the continent to the Nile Valley, they brought with them their celebrations. And what the priesthood of Kemet did was to take those celebrations and synthesize them and make them into one supranational and ethnic type of celebration that was based upon the idea of inclusion rather than exclusion. That all perspectives of spirituality that are truly founded upon the reverence of the creation are acceptable, and we can work them into the overall framework. And therefore, there were national priesthoods that cultivated and extended these spiritual brotherhoods and sisterhoods. They built spiritual memorials. They built temples and tombs and statues as a part of the celebration of the creation, of the recognition of the work of God. And every one of them was built on the image that God put forth in the universe. But there was change over the years. The spiritual system grew and expanded and made modifications as the history presented itself. As historical conditions changed, the spiritual system in its outer appearance changed to meet those different situations. But the one thing that we can say about it is that for the 4,000 years of a viable Kemetic spirituality, that there was a constant spirit of renewal. After about 1,000 years, when the country seemed to be drifting, when spirituality seems to be drifting away from the people, or the people drifting away from spirituality, what you had was the proclamation of a Waheme Mzee, and that is a repetition of the birth, of going back to the foundations and building on those spiritual foundations. And that idea of a perpetual Waheme Mzee, that the Renaissance, because that's the first definition of what we now call a Renaissance, because the Renaissance is not something that happens one time. It's not something that is in the past, but it is a perpetual feature of African spirituality. There is a constant renewal, a constant rebirth, and that is what kept African spirituality in existence in its vibrant form in the Nile Valley for 4,000 years. It started in Kush, it went into Kemet, and then it ended in Kush before the forces that I'm going to talk about in a minute descended upon it. One of the reasons that African spirituality in the Nile Valley was weak, so that when the foreigners descended on it, it began to collapse and fade away, is because of a crisis of the governing system. That is, what happened is that the governors, because of the cosmopolitan nature of African culture in the Nile Valley, began to flirt with foreign ideas and began to incorporate foreign anti-spiritual forces into their governments. And that undermined the cooperation between the priesthood and the governing agents. And that began to grow. And finally, because of the warfare between the priests and the pharaohs, the system began to collapse. It took about 1,000 years for it to finally fade out. There was one attempt to restore it in what they call the 25th dynasty, or what John Henry Clark calls Kemet's last walk in the sun, when the very, very black people from the interior of Africa said, we got to go back down there and restore that which we built in the first place. And Pianki and Shabaka and so forth and so on, as Brother Coleman pointed out last night, went down to try to restore it one more time. And even though it finally failed in a substantial sense, we must recognize that that form of spiritual culture fed much of the world, that the Jews came into the Nile Valley time after time and drank from the deep well of African spirituality and took it out into their part of the world to try to revive what they were doing. And the Greeks, and on, they went into that deep well. When the Christians came in, they went into that deep well and took something out to try to revive what they were doing. And that leads us to what I call the first and the second comings. The first and the second comings of these revealed religions, of these proselytizing religions, of these intolerant religions that brought atrocity and warfare against African spirituality. And I don't mean to upset anybody who is practicing Christianity or practicing Islam, but I just want to point out some things about our historical association with those imports from the Western Asia. In the first place, Christianity came into the African world almost as soon as the Christian movement started. It came into Kemet, it came into what we now call Ethiopia, into Aksum. And it came in as a refugee movement. And with the toleration and the openness of African people, the African people opened up and said, come on in. But from the very beginning, those movements challenged African spirituality because they were monopolistic, because they asserted that there's only one way. They immediately confronted the tolerance in African spirituality. African spirituality could live with them, but they found it difficult to live with African spirituality until they discovered in that first coming that if they weren't tolerant about African spirituality, they weren't going to stay in Africa. And so they allowed an Africanization of Christianity. And therefore, when you look at the Coptic church, which dominated the first coming in Egypt, in Ethiopia, and later in the Sudan, When you look at the Coptic church, you can see a great deal of Africanism. If you go to Ethiopia today and go to some of the temples, you will see that there's some Africanism there. If you talk to the Coptics in Egypt, you will see that there's some Africanization there. But however much those first comings were Africanized, they still led to division and alienation among African people. And throughout the history of Ethiopia, and throughout the history of the Coptic Church, there has been alienation between those Christian establishments and true African spirituality. We have to accept that. The same is true of the first coming of Islam. Islam came into Africa as a jihad. The jihad didn't work in what we call Africa south of the Sahara. It got turned back, and so they had to try another way to get in. And so they came in more or less as traders, as merchants, as people of goodwill, asking for cooperation. And they therefore were conducive to some Africanization. And therefore, in the first coming, Islam also was Africanized to a certain extent. But there are certain things that we have to be aware of. They've also brought in the Ba'at, the trade in African men and women. It began almost as soon as Islam got into Africa. That chattel slave industry was begun. That's one thing. And the other thing is, however much Islam in its first coming was Africanized, it still tended to divide and alienate African people. Began to take over and compete with the African tradition. If you notice, the story of Sundiata, which is supposed to come from that period, for example, as glorious as that story is, if you notice the details of it, what it does is to pit Islam against African traditions, and it puts African traditions in the position of being evil. The fight against the So-So people that Sundiata led, the fight of the Islamic Africans against the Mossi Empire, you see, and the fact that history, much of African history in that part of the world is designed to show that Islam was a superior form of spirituality to true African spirituality. So even in the first comings, there were some great problems in this warfare. This warfare had begun. In the second comings, of course, that story is all too familiar because the second coming is with us now. That is, when Christianity came in the 15th century with the Portuguese, and then the Spanish and the English and the French and the Dutch and so forth and so on, and brought in the present, the 18th and 19th century slave industry, chattel slave industry, and brought in the missionaries, we experienced a kind of spiritual tyranny that is unique in human history. The educational tyranny, the religious despotism that was visited on African people is something that we still suffer from. Severe alienation is the condition of most African people because of this tyranny. And African people responded as best they could. They took this second coming Christianity and tried to Africanize it through the Ethiopian movement that took root here in the Western Hemisphere and also on the continent of Africa. But whatever the case, we still are suffering from that tyranny, from that intrusion, from that warfare against African spirituality. If you look at what's going on in Uganda today, for example, with that absurd Christian movement that is just slaughtering people out of hand in northern Uganda, that is something that we have to really come to grips with and have to understand that that is a product of African people abandoning African spirituality and being caught up in the tyranny of Western spirituality. And the same is true with the second coming of Islam. Because in the second coming of Islam, the jihad came back into Black Africa with Dan Fodio and that group, who sometimes are celebrated as great heroes. We have to understand that they were bringing a kind of religious tyranny on African people that was designed to stamp out African spirituality. And today we see manifestations of that in the Sudan, where the Sharia is in operation, and we see it emerging again in Nigeria, where the northern Nigerians of today are issuing the call for the Sharia, and that is resulting in another bloodbath in Nigeria. We have to face these realities. We have to face the fact that this is the terrain that we have to operate in. This is going on today. Warfare against African spirituality. And what we need then, in view of that warfare, is some kind of spiritual, cultural, and religious non-aggression agreement. That in the African world, at this point, while we are trying to get it together, while we are trying to restore an African agenda, what we have to do is to decide that we are not going to be aggressive against each other in a spiritual sense. We're going to have to respect each spiritual tradition until we can get things straightened out. We're going to have to stop trying to impose on African people this or that. We're going to have to allow African people to operate from where they are and try to get them to where we all should be. So what I would say to those of us who are still practicing Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, that's fine. Africanize it as much as you can, but believe me, you still have another step to take. You still have another step to take to get the true African spirituality. So, let us then look for the deep wells of African spirituality. Let us look for the deep wells. You can't draw anything from the well unless you find it. You've got to find the well before you can draw something from it. Because the whole African universe is on a spiritual and cultural desert. The desiccation of the Sahel, which is growing south, inch by inch, mile by mile every year, is just simply the physical aspect of what is happening to African humanity all over the world. And that is the desiccation of our culture, the desiccation of our spirituality. So we have to recognize that. And in this desert, there are a few oases. And there are thousands of mirages. And when you stand in the middle of the desert and you're looking out there, it's difficult to tell the mirage from the oasis. And most of us have been moving toward mirages, because that's what our leaders are equipped to do, is to lead us to the mirage. Because our leaders have been telling us for 300 years that if you become a Catholic, if you become a Methodist, if you become a Presbyterian, if you become a Congregationalist, if you become a Baptist, it's going to be all right. And so we run to those mirages. We drench ourselves in that sand and begin to realize there's no water there at all. There's nothing but more sand. And then they tell us, well, you haven't been devout enough. And if you look out there, you see that if you could get there, then it's going to be all right. And so you run out there and you find the same thing. If you get a PhD, get educated, start using deodorants, start dressing more civil, start talking more proper. In other words, our leaders are parroting what their masters are telling them about how to get out of this desert. If you stop dancing, if you stop drumming, if you stop shaking when you experience spirituality, then you will reach your destination. And so the mirage has us captivated, the tyranny of the mirage. The problem with the few oases that are out there is, in the first place, they are hard to discover. It's hard to separate them from the fraudulent oases, because there are a lot of brothers and sisters out there who are crooks, who got something that looks like an oasis, but it's just as detrimental as the other kind of mirage. It's really a mirage. Those true oases that are out there are scattered and separated. The few communities that hang on to African spirituality and that continue to cultivate it are isolated. It's difficult to find. They don't have the proper resources in order to truly establish themselves in an intergenerational sense. And so we have a lot of difficulty in this desert with many mirages and a few oases. And so we have to look around into our library, into our heritage, into our historical journey to see whether there are some models out there that we can start looking at. And I would suggest 3 models that will give us something. They are not the only ones, there are many more, but 3 models. One is the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution is a model that we can look at, starting with Bookman's prayer, that I'm going to come back to toward the end of my talk. Bookman's prayer, which really told us that we have to come back home. In order to begin a revolution, you have to come back home. That's the beginning, that is the foundation. You have to come back home. Because we have fought many, many battles. You know, we have established many campaigns. We have done a lot of sweat, a lot of crime, and a lot of bleeding. Over the centuries, we have fought this and that and the other. But when you think about it, almost every time we were fighting the wrong war, giving up our lives in the wrong war, the Civil War. It looked like a good war for us to get involved in, but when it was over, you know, World War I, a lot of, my daddy tells me that a lot of young men and women were very enthusiastic about that. If we get involved in this war, it's going to be better. But they came back to strange fruit. So we fought many, many wars and many battles. It's not a matter of courage. It's not a matter of energy. We put in the energy and all that kind of stuff. But somehow or another, we've been fighting the wrong war all this time. And so the Haitian Revolution then comes to us as a deep well that we can get something out of. Because it started with the proclamation that we must return to African spirituality. And throughout that revolution, the place of Vodun was prominent. The Vodun of the forest of Haiti, the Vodun of the so-called Maroons, the free and independent communities, constantly fed and kept alive that spirit of freedom that finally resulted in the first revolution against slavery in the history of humanity, and the most important and significant military event in the history of the modern world, although nobody knows that because the European intellectuals have decided to hide the significance of that event from us. And then when Dessalines finally pushed the French and the English and the Spaniards off the island and proclaimed independence, he inserted in the Constitution many things that we could go through, but one thing in this context is very important, and that is freedom of religion. Now, it sounds as though freedom of religion is nothing but a repetition of what the French and the Americans had done. But what Dessalines meant by freedom of religion is to take away the stigma for Vodou. What he wanted to make certain was that the Haitian people were not forbidden from continuing to practice Vodou. That's why they say, even 200 years later, that even though 90% of the Haitians are Catholic, 100% practice Vodou. And even though the Haitian Revolution finally was sort of truncated because of the playing around of various leaders, nonetheless, that is a powerful model for us to look at. The revolution was so tied to African spirituality that explains the miracle. How did these 500,000 African people with nothing but grapes and hoes, how did they beat Napoleon's best army? Napoleon had the most efficient army in the world at that time, and they defeated his army. How did they do it? African spirituality. That. The second model, of course, we've already talked about, and that's Kemet. That the thing that kept Kemet going for 4,000, the Nile Valley civilization going for 4,000 years, is the ability of African spirituality to knit African peoples together. The foundations of that spiritual system in the Nile Valley were the common principles of African spirituality and the realization that in order for African spirituality to work in the context of the world as it was developing in those years was to develop an urban and cosmopolitan orientation for African spirituality. And I'll say a few things about that in a few minutes. Thus what you had was the evolution of a synthetic, multi-ethnic nation, a true African union that emphasized a respect for local divinities, local religious groups, local, to put it in the terms of the literature expressly, the local God. A profound respect. Every city, every community had its own perspective on African spirituality. And the system was able to coordinate all of that and keep all of those people together without falling out with each other and without starting spiritual warfare. That was one of the great contributions of Kemet that we often overlook. How can you keep all of those millions of African people who have different perspectives on spirituality with the same principles, however, how do you keep them from falling apart? The third model is something that Kwame Nkrumah pointed out in his book, Consciousness. I have often criticized Brother Nkrumah, even though I have a profound respect for his commitment and the role that he has played in African liberation. I have often criticized him, and I think my criticism of him, where I criticize him, is valid even now. And that is when he said, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and everything will be added unto you." I disagree with that. I think that seek ye first the spiritual kingdom, and everything will be added to you. But there's something that Nkrumah did point out in this, what is called a philosophical work, Consciousness, that is important. He said, let us recognize the fact that in Africa you have 3 strands in one place, and then another place he called them 3 features, and another place he called them 3 segments. Traditional African culture, Islam, and Christianity. We have to recognize that African people are divided along those cultural bases. But he didn't go as far as Mzee did, who took this idea and just simply made it a vulgar idea by calling it African's triple heritage. If you remember when Mzee presented his television series on Africa, he tried to elevate this to really assert that each one of these were authentic African traditions. But what Nkrumah pointed out is that while we recognize that the African peoples are divided among those three traditions, so to speak, that only one of them is truly authentically African, and that is the African tradition, and that in resolving those differences and creating a true African union, the African spirituality is going to have to prevail. That's something that Mzee didn't really point out, because he has an interest in ignoring that. So if we look at those three models, I think we have something we can work with. And if we look at it in terms of the one African leader in our history who really wrestled with this problem, perhaps more than any other, I think we can see a way back home. And that is Edward Wilmot Blyden. Edward Wilmot Blyden was born and raised in his early life in the Christian tradition. He became a Christian minister. He came from the Caribbean. He came to America, as it is called, the United States. Then he went to Africa. Then he went to Europe. In other words, he was truly a universal African in terms of space. He traveled around the whole African world. He went to Kenya. And so he had an African experience that was unusual for his day and time. But in terms of his spirituality, he started out as a Christian minister, filled with missionary zeal. When he first went to Liberia, his idea was to go over there and convert those heathens to Christianity. And as he began his mission, he suddenly realized that Christianity wasn't the solution, it was the problem. And so, by the time he got into his 60s, after he was trying to fight with that for most of his life, he converted to Islam. That's something that most of us don't know. He converted to Islam. And after a few years, because he thought that Islam was more tolerant of African spirituality, of African culture. And so he converted to Islam. And Liberia really lost a lot of money when he converted to Islam. Because at that time he was the president of the College of Liberia, and all of the philanthropists withdrew their money from the college. And while he was struggling with that, he had another revelation. And in his 70s, he turned to African spirituality. And he wrote that wonderful little thin volume, African Life and Customs, where he embraced African spirituality. And so he went the full circle. He went through Christianity, through Islam, and then came back home. He took that step, and therefore his life, I think, stands as a testament to what is possible, what we can do, and where we are as we travel through this desert. So let us then take a few swigs from this water in the deep well, as my brother Greg talked about, my little brother. I'm so happy that ASCAC is an intergenerational association. Shemsu. And that's what it ought to be, because so many of our movements have died when the charismatic founders died. Some of that's due to the ego that often accompanies leadership. Many of us, get to be president or something, or chairman or something, and we sort of take that a little too seriously. And we think that the thing came wrong unless we're the chairman or the president. but you know, we gotta start looking at that a little bit more. The way I found out about it was long before I got to be a so-called leader of anything but a party group. But back in my party days, we used to meet at the Savoy every day. I didn't think the Savoy could run unless I was there. You know, when I opened it up and closed it down. Wherever else I would go, I could go to another affair, but I always came back and closed the Savoy down. And, you know, it was so that when I walked in the Savoy, people, hey, Jay. And then I got real sick. And they didn't think I was going to make it. And one day, while I was sick, before the word got out that I was on the recovery, I peeked my head in the Savoy. And do you know, things was going on as though I never had existed. And that's something I think you have to come to grips with. That this world is going on whether it is or not. And we have to start planning our organizational activity, our institutional building based upon that. And so I'm glad to see Shemsu and these youngsters. And I'm glad that I'm still sane enough to pass this torch on. And lean on that staff of old age, because we have tried to give them good speech as much as is possible. And we hope that they have listened. And they will take us to heights that my generation was not able to reach. We could envision it, but we couldn't reach it. So anyway, let us take a few swigs from this deep well. As I said, the Jehewty is extremely important. We have to adopt that principle that creation isn't something that happened. Creation is a happening. It is a happening. It's here and now. It's not something that we did once or that the Lord did once and it's never going to be done again. It is a happening. It is a part of the African worldview. And the great principle that comes out of and that was cultivated during the Jehewty about 2000 BC, when the Jehewty started. The great principle that was really cultivated there was Mat, or as you say, Mahat. Mat is the principle that is the creative force of the universe, with all of the dynamic and energetic components of reality. There is a Matian foundation, a foundation that puts everything in its proper place and that keeps everything in balance. That is Mat. That is the model of human existence. Mat. Everything. Not even the Creator is conceptualized as being free from Mat. In one text, we are told that the Creator must imbibe his daughter Mat, and he must be surrounded by his daughter Mat. In other words, he has to ingest it. It has to be inside him, and it must be around him. Mat is really the guiding principle of the universe. Another principle of African spirituality is unicity. The unity of everything in the universe. Sister Latrella in her invocation this morning talked about the worms, talked about the birds, and talked about the plants. Everything is a member of the family of existence. Everything is divine. There is no alienation between the Creator and the creation. Everything in the creation is divine. That is a principle of African spirituality that must be submitted to. Everything. Once you are able to understand what that means, then the problem of Mat on earth, the problem of Mat in humanity, becomes very simple. That you do not violate anything in the universe. You approach everything in the universe as a personality. You approach the bug as a personality. You approach the tree as a personality. You approach the wind as a personality. Just think, if the world practiced that, there would be no smog. There would be no ozone hole up there. There would be no situation where you can't do anything. You know, think about life now. There are a few things that everybody will agree or enjoy, like eating and having sex. Universal from the standpoint of just the bottom line, so to speak. And now you can't do either one of those things without fearing that you're going to die. They are both essential to life, but you can't do either one of them without fearing you're going to die. And so what we have to do is to understand the familyhood, the ujamaa, that is in the universe. That is Africa. We have to get back to that. We also have to understand that eternity, even though it is opaque in terms of our ability to comprehend it, you know, for example, every time you think about eternity, the only way you can attempt to define it, unless you have some exceptional insight that I don't have, you have to define it in terms of its opposite, and that's time. Because when you think of eternity, you say without time. But even though it's difficult to conceptualize, it's difficult to conceive in terms of how it operates, we have to realize that this is eternal, that this universe is eternal, and that nothing was either created, nothing in the normal sense of creation, and nothing is destroyed. That everything continues forever and ever and ever. Everything always has been, is now, and always will be. And that it is truly universal, everywhere. One of the formulas in the iconography of Kemet, where the deceased person is receiving the breath of life and receiving the gift of God, one of them is Mire Jet, which most people translate out as like the sun forever. But if you, and I don't want to get too technical here, but if you look at the word jet, you can interpret it not only as forever, but also as everywhere, like the sun everywhere. The sun is everywhere, you know, in our universe, and so we have to look at it like that. It is, and the other principle that we have to emphasize within that unicity is the idea of immanence. That everybody and everything is divine. It is at hand. You don't have to go through the eye of a needle. You don't have to have the confession of original sin in order to enter the kingdom. It's at hand. It's right here. All you have to do is cultivate what the Creator has placed. Some of the selected features are, that keep us grounded, the idea of Amun, the hidden one. That keeps us grounded. When we realize that I don't care how spiritual you are, how much you've studied, how devoted you seem to be, how much a master of the ritual you are, that you don't know everything. And you ain't gonna know everything. That there is a profound mystery to existence. That there are a lot of things you can know. The things you can know will lead you to the good life. But what you have to understand is that nobody will ever completely solve all of the mysteries of the universe. However arrogant science may become, we have to accept that. Accept the humility that is involved in that. And we also have to recognize that existence is a gift. We have to accept existence as a gift. We have to accept the proclamation that you find in the iconography in Kemet, that I, the Creator, I have given all life, all power, and all help. Accept that. The Creator has given that. The special gift that the Creator has given is Madu Nature, that is the divine speech. That is the thing that makes human beings unique, is the divine speech, what some people call the Word of God. And we express that through the cultivation of Madu Nefer. Madu Nefer means good speech. That you are on the track to obeying God when you are consciously pursuing good speech, because speech is the mode of human interaction. Speak. You can make human beings do things a lot of ways, but the human way is through speech. When you can speak with such authority that the person spoken to will sedge, that is, will listen, that is, will obey because it's right, then you are ready. You're on the path of the way of life, as the Kemetic people put it. And the Creator has given us some special equipment to do our human project. That we have a project. When you come into this world, when you are born, when you come from your mother's womb, you are an officer. You are an officer. That is your appointment to office. And you have to treat that life, what you call life, that period between the time you come out of the womb and the time you pop into the ground. You have to treat that as an office, a space and an opportunity for you to perform a service. That's what the human project is to perform a service, because the Creator is performing a service by giving us life, power, and health. And we must follow that model and get ourselves together. So we have some special equipment. We have a kit, that is a body. We have a bar, that is a personality. And we must make certain that our personality is not phony. You know, like you say, so-and-so is phony. In other words, their personality, the personality that they put forth, is different from who they really are. Okay. And you know that. You know that. You know who's phony and who isn't phony. So you have to make certain that your body is consistent with you. And then, of course, you have the eternal life force that is given to you as you come into this life. They're called the Ka. And then you have the Eve, the heart, which is the center of judgment, the center of knowledge, your Eve. That part of you that is really responsible. And so you have that equipment. And you, in addition to that, you also have some other special equipment. Even though it may be a little submerged. You have your Sia, which is exceptional perception. That is, when you cultivate what is in you as the divine essence of you, when you cultivate it, you can see clearly. You can see things that you couldn't ordinarily see. You have clarity. You can understand things that seem to dumbfound most people. You also have Hu, and that is articulation, the ability to express your thoughts with clarity so that everybody can understand you and understand that what you are saying is correct. And therefore you don't have any problem with obedience. And you also have Heikak, what some people call magic. But it's just extraordinary power to accomplish what the mind and the tongue command. When you have a clear mind, a clear tongue, you can do things, you can move mountains. You can do things that you didn't think were possible. You can accomplish things. When there's clarity in ASCAP, we can do things that the day before we decided seemed impossible. We produced the first volume of the African World History Project. People say, you can't do that. We produced a hardback that everybody that's been in contact with it says, ooh, magnificent. You know, we did that because we have clarity, because we have Sia, Hudi, and Hakon. That's the equipment that the Creator has given us to do this. One of the things that you find in the book of The Voice is True is this statement by the Creator. I did 4 good deeds at the gate of the horizon. That is, at the beginning of what you call time, I did 4 good deeds. I made the 4 winds that everybody might breathe thereof. That is 1 deed. I made the great inundation, the great flood, that the poor might have rights like the great. That is 1 deed. I made everybody like their fellows. I did not command that they do evil. It was in their hearts through which they violated what I said. That was 1 of the deeds. I made their hearts to cease from forgetting the West, and that is the land of eternity, in order that divine offerings might be given to the gods of the localities. And that is 1 of the deeds. In other words, we have a gift from the Creator. We have been given an office to work in, to serve Him, so that we might do what the Creator commands. And what the command is first of all, to center. That is to listen, to obey, to understand the gift of God, and to understand the command of God. And that command, in brief formula, is Jed Mat Ilmat. Jed is speak, and Il is do. That is not sufficient to talk about it. I mean, that's what we're doing now, is talking about it. But you got to do it. That if you talk about it and you haven't done it, then you are not speaking good. Excuse my grammar. You're not speaking good because it doesn't represent it doesn't represent the truth. You know, I don't care how articulately you express something, if it doesn't represent what you did, it's a lie. And so you have to obey that command. And then you have to imitate what the creation presents you with. That's the memorial that you see in the Nile Valley. When we go to the Nile Valley, and we go from Memphis to Gaza to Giza to Luxor and to Abu Simbel, when we go there, what we see is the human celebration of the creation. The pyramid, the obelisk, the tombs, the temples, the iconography, all of those, and the writings, all of those are attempts to repeat what the Creator has done as much as is humanly possible. Therefore, we are commanded to give life and power and health. Obey the good laws. And that means obeying the good laws. What are the good laws? You say, well, you know, when you're spiritual, you're supposed to be in another realm. But this kind of spirituality, while it does not prevent you from entering another realm, it does not depreciate your association with that higher realm. It commands you to do stuff right here on earth. And that's what is important for us, is to get to work down here on earth. This is where our big job is, right here on earth. It means that you have to help people. You have to give life. You have to give food to those who are hungry, and clothes, and transportation to those who don't have it. You have to give a lift, an uplift, a helping hand to somebody who's stumbling and falling. And more importantly, you have to teach and educate those who are ignorant, those fools. You have to educate them. You have to get their attention. You have to open their eyes. Those who are blind, you have to open their eyes. You have to show them what the world is really like. And then finally, you have to give them speech. You have to enable those who are speech impaired, in the general sense of speech impairment, those who cannot articulate this connection with the divine. You have to teach them good speech so that they can begin to walk on the right way. We have to demonstrate piety. Piety. That profound, highest attitude toward divinity. Toward the divinity that is in everything. We have to begin to do that. And that doesn't mean that you have to walk around holier than thou. It just means that you have to respect everybody and everything. You have to participate in the continuity of the intergenerational transmission of culture and spirituality. You have to understand that this is just a moment where we are now. That you may make it to 90 years old, but it's just a flash. It's just a flash. That you are connected from the beginning of what we call time to the end of time, and that you are a vital link in that. And that any flaw in that link is a blemish on the human project. And so you must understand that what you have to do is to respect the ancestral tradition. We have to put our ancestral tradition together because the people who have been at war against us have tried to break our connection with our ancestors. They have tried to debase our ancestors and accuse our ancestors of paganism and savagery and ignorance. And therefore we go around ashamed of our ancestors. But what we have to understand is that however much our ancestors might have not seen everything clearly, they were trying as best they could to get out of this mess and to leave a better world for us than they found. And we have to, continue that tradition. We have to practice those rituals and show respect for those rituals. We have to realize that life for us is a series of development stages. And every one of those stages we have to celebrate. We have to come to the temple as a community in order to revitalize ourselves, in order to renew that mot that is within us all. We have an idea of what that means in terms of walking around this earth. And Intet, whose name means something like the gift, the son of sin, the son of the sister, who said, I am silent with the angry, patient with the ignorant, so as to quell strife. I am cool, and that's one of my favorite postures, is coolness. That's what we used to say when we were kids. How you doing, man? I'm cool. But that is, you have to be cool. You have to be free of haste, knowing the outcome, expecting what comes. I'm a speaker in situations of strife. I'm friendly when I hear my name to those who would tell me their concerns. I'm controlled, kind, friendly, one who calms the weaker with good words. I'm bright-faced, open-handed, an owner of food who does not cover my face. I'm a friend to the poor, one well-disposed to the have-not. I'm one who feeds the hungry and needy, who is open-handed to those without. I am a source of knowledge for those who lack knowledge. I'm one who teaches a person what is useful. And I'm a listener who listens to Marx and who ponders it in my heart. I'm kindly and not hot-tempered. One does not attack a person for a remark. I'm accurate like the scales, straight and true like Jehewty, the founder of wisdom and speech. I'm a knower who teaches myself knowledge. And I'm a speaker in the hall of Marx. skill in speech in trying situations. That is one glimpse at an ideal spiritual Africa. That's the way we have to start thinking about ourselves as an office holder, someone who is appointed on this earth to serve. And we have to define what that means. But what it does mean is giving life and power and help as much as is within our power. So let me wind down here with a little advice. One of the things that, you know, there are a lot of in this kind of outbreak of movement towards African spirituality, sometimes we get a little carried away, and we sort of, in my opinion, get things out of balance a little bit. Let us not think of African spirituality as a romance between you and the Almighty. Think about it. That is, that nobody else is talking with God but me. And me and God are tight. And God speaks to me every morning to tell you what you ought to be doing. We got to get out of that. We got to get out of that. The divine is open to everybody. It is open to everybody. And we are all traveling in that direction in our own time and pace. And we have to respect it. We can teach, we can suggest, and we can urge. But let us not believe that we are having a romance, a little individual, head-to-head with God. And let us also remember this, that while there's a place for secrets, and you don't blare about everything that is on your mind, like when I first got to Chicago, and the young Panthers used to make public announcements every day about what they were going to do. And I would say, hey, brother, don't tell the man what you're going to do. We're going to be on Madison and State at 4 p.m. with our revolutionary proposal. And they weren't able to gather at Madison State. The man was there. You know what I mean? He kept them from meeting. There is a place for the secrets. But our major job at this point, and under these conditions, and in this mess we are in, is clarification and not mystification. What we need to do is to clarify spirituality for African people rather than mystify it. To make it known that it's available to everybody. Every African has this spiritual route available. All you have to do is commit yourself to start looking at your life as an altar, to start looking at the gift of God and the command of God. And that is life, power, and health. I said the occult has its place, but it must not promote tyranny, exclusiveness, and the idea of superiority and the idea that we are doing it better than you are. What we say in the Temple of the African Community of Chicago is that we are attempting to restore an authentic form of African spirituality. We don't have all the answers. And we respect the way other African people approach the restoration of African spirituality. And we appreciate it because it's going to take all of us going in those various, along those various paths, as long as we keep the objective in view. So what we have to do is to realize that symbolically we are building the temple. We are rebuilding the temple. Our temples have been desecrated. Our monuments have been reduced to ruins. Our ancestors have been denigrated. Our heritage has been ridiculed. Our people have been oppressed and suppressed. And what we have to do is to change all of it. We have to restore that which is in ruin. We have to rebuild those temples that have been destroyed. We have to restore African spirituality. As I said, we have to stop just simply talking about it. We must link those oases that are scattered out throughout humanity, throughout African humanity. We have to link those oases up together. Coordinate what they're doing and reestablish African spirituality. Because the forces we are up against are organized and unified in a significant sense, even though they have their little family fights. You know, but look at the power of the Catholic Church, the Roman Church. Look at the power of the Greek Church. Look at the power of Islam. Look at the power even of Buddhism. We have to realize that we're in a world now where spirituality has to be united in order, I'm sorry to say, this may sound inconsistent with spirituality, but in order to fight this spiritual war, we have to do it. I was in Venezuela several years ago. Went to one of the museums there, and they had a mural that was as long as this wall. And in this mural, they showed 3 gods with their devotees supporting them. One was the god of the indigenous people, the Indians, as we call them. The other was the Africans, and the other was the Europeans. And needless to say, the European gods and God and his adherents were utterly destroying the gods of the indigenous people and the African people. They are at war. They have committed atrocities. We have been victimized by that kind of tyranny and that kind of despotism and those kinds of atrocities, that kind of blitzkrieg. And we have to recognize that we are at war. And we have to mobilize ourselves in a spiritual sense in order to make certain that we win that war. Because the war will be won. This war will be won in the hearts of African people when we can proclaim that African people are together on this spiritual formula. When we no longer see African so-called Christians fighting other Africans. When we no longer see African Muslims fighting other Africans. When we see Africans united on the spiritual plane, then we know that we are on the road. So we have to rebuild the temple. We have to not only practice rituals in small groups, we have to not only have conferences like this where we talk about it, but we got to do it. We have to establish the temple. We have to have regular renewals of our spirit, regular coming together of our spirit. That, I think, is a reality that we have to confront. And therefore, let me wind it down by reminding you of something that I think I said the first time I spoke to an ASCAC group in New York about the Sinuity, about Sinuate, who left home as a young man because he was afraid of the problem of putting it back together. Things had kind of fallen apart in Kemet, and he was afraid that that was going to overwhelm him, and so he went to a foreign country and he found it attractive in his young life. He thought he was intrigued by this exotic foreign culture, and he fell into it, and he became a naturalized citizen, and he married and had a family and participated in the war, became an officer in their army and all that kind of stuff. And then one day he found out he wasn't homeless. One of the great foreigners reminded him of that in a very painful way. And even though he won the little struggle, after he had won it, he wrote to the Pharaoh and asked the Pharaoh, could he come back home? And the Pharaoh said, I don't know why you left in the first place, but whatever the case, come back to Kemet, come back to the black community, see the cradle city, it's the place where you came into existence, and kiss the ground at the great gate and mingle with your brothers and sisters. And in order to do that, we have one thing left on our agenda, and that is what Bookman Duddy said on August the 14th, 1791, when he organized the Haitian Revolution on the basis of African spirituality. Throw away the image of the white man's God who has so often brought down our tears, and listen to liberty, which speaks in all our hearts. I'm sure that we will be hearing much more from you as you hold the staff for us to continue our growth. Thank you so much. Give them another round of applause. I think we're going to break now, and we will return at 1 o'clock, and we will resume the program at that time. Thank you so much for participating this morning. We hope you will join us again at 1 o'clock today. Excuse me? Lunch? Lunch can be had in the cafeteria in this building. We don't have food vendors, and that is in the N wing. There's a cafeteria